My treaty perspective on First Nations laws and legal orders and jurisdiction themed room. So we have Teddy Maniwoon, G4 Justice Director with Tsuut'ina Nation in the Treaty 7 territory. Teddy, a Two-Spirit Tsuut'ina First Nation member of Treaty 7, has been the G4 SNTTC's Director of Justice since 2022. Teddy co-chairs the Tsuut'ina Nation Tuscana Police Commission. You're gonna have to help me with that one. Thank you. Since 2022. Teddy has been on an AFN policing task force and hopes we can develop mechanisms that honor treaty rights to justice and safety and foster community connection for all people of Turtle Island through conversations that grow our communities. We also have Crystal Manywoons with the G4 Treaty 7. Crystal is the lead at G4's Justice. She has vast experience advocating for Indigenous rights and advancing justice for First Nations communities while helping support the next generation of Indigenous leaders. Crystal is committed to building lasting capacity around First Nations laws and justice systems, grounding her efforts in traditional knowledge, community-led solutions, and a deep respect for cultural sovereignty. We have Nicole Robertson, Musqueam Productions, G4 Support. Nicole, a proud member of the Matthias Column Tree Nation in Treaty 6 territory. Nicole has dedicated her life to creating awareness about Indigenous peoples through media, having spent over 30 years breaking down stereotypes through mainstream screen industries and media on cultural protocols when filming and engaging with First Nations communities. And we also have Gregory White, also with G4. That was the extent of the bio. So Gregory White.
Thank you. Daranastara, thank you all for having me today. I see some friends in the audience, I see some family, I see wonderful friends who've supported me in a lot of really wonderful endeavors that I've been able to encounter. Today I wanted to talk about my understanding of my treaty and the importance of revitalizing our laws through our languages, through our intentions and our ways of knowing. I hope today we're able to have a conversation with each other. I really want to structure this not only as a presentation of understanding, but I want to put it out there and to be very transparent that I don't have all the answers. What I do have is an understanding gifted to me from my leadership and my elders, and I hope to share that understanding with you all today and spark a conversation so we can provide clarity together. What I love about this space and what I love about the space in AFN, it connects us. And it connects us in a way where it was said yesterday in the opening keynote. It connects us in networks where we can amplify our voices together, truly. It's to say in each one of our nations, and each one of our chiefs and leaders and elders and matriarchs and warriors and children, every single one of us has value added. Something that they always tell me in the Stoney Nakoda Nations is before colonization, we had a value in our camps and everybody had a value back into the system. I think that's not only important, but it's incumbent for us to recognize and realize. Something else that I'm learning is the use of our languages to develop our ways of knowing and our practices. Whereas maybe we change the vernacular away from what's wrong with you or why are you like that? But in the Stoney language, they have a saying and phrase that translates to, your mind is poor. And if your mind is poor, how can we work together as a community to enrich that mind, to feed that mind so that collectively we are laying the seeds for forests that we can flourish in from 7 generations from now. And so I'm really excited to have all of you here today to share my understanding of treaty, my understanding of jurisdiction, and our requirements in developing our laws for our people, our ways, and some of the roadblocks. Before I introduce my team and introduce the importance of not only having a team, but how that network functions and amplifies this voice, I will also share with you a presentation written with my elders on my nations regarding how we utilize treaty to administer adjudication, government systems, and governance on our lands. But I wanted to share this with you because it was something that I worked very definitively on while we were developing the essential service legislation mechanisms and understanding around how that was going to work. And it was just such an impactful piece that I'm so grateful for and I will forever keep in my records and repository. I also want everybody to know that after this presentation, our presentation PowerPoint and the paper that I'm going to be reading to you today will be available on our website. And I encourage everybody to please download it and utilizing it, because another thing that we have been saying here, and I want to thank Chief TG and recognize him for saying this, is we're not just knowledge keepers, but we're knowledge sharers. Truly. Something my father always tells me as a sun dancer, as a sweat lodge, as a pipe holder, said When we keep our knowledge, it further fractures our communities. It further fractures our ability to work together. And when we work together, as the Stony Nakota people talk about, a spider web, natural law, that connection can only work and it can only sustain life when it is properly connected. When there is a disconnect, the entire ecosystem of that space, that entire ecosystem, fails to provide the sustenance that we all require as First Nations people, that we require to derive from the natural laws that we understand and that were gifted to us by our ancestors, by Creator. And so with that, thank you all for joining me today. I hope to spark a wonderful conversation. So today I'm going to provide you a presentation on the importance of treaty, the relationship with Canada, and legislative implications, and the ability to conduct administration on our lands. Treaty on Tsuut'ina Nation is the source mechanism of where we derive our rights. It wasn't long ago I was sitting in Parliament with members of Public Safety Canada discussing our policing systems and the policing system that was going to be developed through the engagement to otherwise get us to an essential service designation. And in that space, they mentioned the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is, yes, an important document here in the government, or here in Canada. However, it is not where we on our lands in Tsuut'ina derive our rights from. Our inherent rights are derived from the blessings of our ancestors, from Creator and from our elders. Our rights as people on our lands, our rights to self-government, our rights to autonomy, our rights to sovereignty. Those are all derived from our understanding of treaty, the Articles of Treaty, and the entering into a treaty with the newcomers. Treaty and Treaty 7, where I'm from, was always meant as an act of peace and friendship. It was meant as an understanding that we are going to coexist with one another, much as they do with the wampum belt in the East, much as they do with many understandings of our people from the ceremonies and traditions. However, that promise continues to be broken. And as that promise is broken, it further exacerbates the challenges that we have faced in our First Nations and that we face as people. I don't believe that all newcomers and all people who are non-Indigenous are here with ill intent and with malicious intent behind their practices. However, the current systems and the solutions derived from these colonial governments, they don't work for our people. They don't work because we keep finding people in the river, because we keep losing women and sisters at an alarming rate. And so what the government, as far as I've experienced, does is they find another solution and put another Band-Aid on the hemorrhage. Whereas I say, if we keep finding people in the river, we need to go upriver and find out why they're falling in the first place. We need to go up with an upstream approach to determine how downstream, and while we get to that downstream, we are finding solutions as we always had in our camps and our ceremony. Ceremony is not only important, it's incumbent and required. It's required for our healing, it's required for our understanding. But the further we live under solution bases that are not our own and not derived from our rights as people to develop things that are important, necessary, and incumbent, the further we are going to keep pulling people out of the river, and I don't believe for a moment any of our elders, mothers, fathers want that. I, every year, hold a sharing circle for women out of my nation, and it is one of the most impactful and profound things that I've done in my career so far. And this year, there was a woman from my community who's lost all of her children, has buried 3 grandchildren. She's lost all of her brothers and sisters. One of her sisters was murdered, and she's also lost her parents. Essentially, she is alone in her familial unit. And I was very worried about her emotional state in this space, talking about the subject of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And it was during a lunch hour where I sat with her to check in on where she's at, and she took my hand and she said, "Teddy, thank you for this, because it makes me realize I'm not alone." Being alone and feeling disconnected can have such reverberating and disastrous effects in our community. Because we were never disconnected from one another. We were never disconnected from our lands. The current systems where we all maybe have to live in boxes of apartments or in cities that don't recognize our need to connection of land further exacerbate the crises of mental health and further push us away from connection that I think is not only so required, but necessary. And to have my elder sit with me at a lunch to say, "Thank you, I know I'm not alone." It reminds me to say that together Together we can really make transformative impact in building our laws, in building our legal orders, but also in instilling our jurisdiction, which is that mechanism of control over our people. I'm going to introduce you to some of my team. Nicole Robertson, who handles a lot of the communications, and we'll discuss the communication component in building that voice, in knowledge sharing, not knowledge keeping, but sharing what it is that we've learned from our lands to determine that some of the best practices may be applied to your lands, in your communities, to amplify that voice, to say that your rights are not distinctive of the Canadian government. They are not imbued by the Canadian government or any government. They come from your ancestors, your elders, and the people that are of your lands, of your communities. Crystal Manywounds, who works a lot with our youth on the First Nations, and youth are the voice that can amplify and really carry forward the needs for the next generation, for the new day. Oftentimes my elders talk about how the youth can see into tomorrow. And if the youth can see into tomorrow, maybe we have to go find out what they're seeing, where we may not. Where the youth have such purity and desire and the energy. And so I'm really excited for Crystal to share some of the initiatives she is taking on in her work. Somebody who will not be presenting today, but I did want to introduce you to our newest member, which is Gregory White. Gregory White will be tackling and leading the anti-human trafficking file in Alberta and in for our nations, to discuss not only why this problem and determine through engagement it affects our people at a much more alarming rate, but to but to determine some solutions that we can implement into these systems and to build laws and legal orders so we can provide protection to the vulnerable people in our communities who may find themselves at risk of being trafficked and or trafficked. We have a great network of survivors we're working with, and I just want to introduce you to the wonderful people who I could not exist without. And again, I'm so grateful to be here. I want to take a moment of intention before I begin my presentation, before we move forward. For those of you who were at the dinner yesterday, and I want to thank the family for providing that. I don't know about anyone else, but I'm going to share two stories. And yes, the story, the reflection that I had yesterday at dinner was one where my husband turned to me, and this is my husband in the front, and I had tears in my eyes, and of course I didn't want to cause concern, so I told him I took a deep yawn. But I didn't. I had tears in my eyes because it wasn't long ago that presentation was illegal. That the people on that stage would have their outfits burned, and they couldn't even talk about practicing potlatch. That all those babies on that stage couldn't dance with joy and sing loudly. And it breaks my heart to think that we have, as a people, had to endure that, and to see that celebrated, to come together as one people, to bring together that celebration is not only important, it's required. It's required because it brings back that joy, that spirit that I know our ancestors were remiss of experiencing, and not because of anything that they did but exist. And for the malicious and shameful practices of Duncan Campbell Scott and the Canadian government, we almost missed out on experiencing that once again, and it brought me great joy. In fact, it brought tears to my heart to be able to experience that. The other moment of intention as we move forward. Every year on My Nation, we have a graduation for the language institution called Gunaha. And this year I was master of ceremony for that space, and we always do a pipe ceremony to begin with. And we had Elder Alex Crowchild and Elder Aubrey Pipestem giving a beautiful pipe ceremony. And the women sat on one side and the men sat on one side. And I serendipitously sat in the middle. And as a two-spirit person, I didn't do that intentionally, but my elders told me, no, this is correct, you sit here. And during the prayer, my elders spoke in their language, and we all closed our eyes. It was quiet on the reserve, it was outdoors. And the only thing you can smell was the smudge in the air and the pipes. As we passed around the pipes and were praying, all I could think of was, before contact, this is how it was. This is who we were. We were blessed by the surroundings of our medicines. We were blessed by the languages of our elders. We were blessed to laugh with one another. We were blessed to celebrate all of the beautiful things that we are and all of the beautiful things that we can achieve, And at that graduation, we had 21 people who were graduating with the revitalization of our language, where only 10 years ago, there were 8 people who spoke the language on my reserve. It was almost extinct. And so with that moment of intention, I want to encourage everybody to share in a conversation around how you are doing things in your community and how we may work with one another. Because revitalizing our ways of being so that we may develop our own laws to protect our people, while also developing our own legal orders from our source rights. For the sake of this discussion, it will be treaty. I think it is very important and resounding. As Treaty First Nations people, we derive our rights from our treaty, which guides our governance, government, institution, and legislative procedures, including lawmaking on our traditional territories. Our treaty partnership with government establishes processes that help First Nations regarding governance parameters set by our leadership and not colonial governments. Established and adopted by First Nations, our leaderships establish the systems for education, housing, infrastructure, public safety, security, economy, our economic practices, our land management, justice, adjudicative practices, and land resources use and regulations. And these exist in our treaty relationship with the Crown in Canada. And I say this all to say, we are constantly given predetermined mechanisms, pre-prescribed mechanisms by these governments that don't work for our people or often place us in limitations with year-to-year funding or program-based approaches. And I encourage everybody to challenge that. Something, again, that was so enlightening to me, that was also my naivete when sitting with ministers in the Ministry of Public Safety Canada, when they said, oh, that blew my mind. I didn't know, I didn't think about your rights being derived from your people. Well, why didn't we think of that? It's because you assumed that because of all the mechanisms of legislation you put forward onto my leadership, you have an assumption. And that assumption cannot work and does not work. It has not worked, and again, if our people, this was told to me by an elder in Lethbridge at the Alberta Association of Police Governance, if people don't know how something works, it doesn't work. The mechanisms created by governments that are not ours do not work. And if they did, we would not be researching or finding out why a majority of our people are incarcerated, why a majority of our people represents all of the research and all of the practices that are deemed as bad. Again, I don't want to use that as a vernacular, but to say maybe their minds are poor, maybe they don't have connection, maybe they don't understand that their rights are not derived from a government that doesn't have their best interest. Their rights are derived by inherently what our ancestors blessed us with on these lands, and by mechanisms of authority by our treaty. And I encourage everybody to challenge that, challenge those notions of colonial governments that predictate how they assume we are going to build legislation and live under those legislative processes, because those don't work for us, and if they did, we wouldn't continue to be fighting for what is rightfully ours and for our rights, which again are predetermined by our ancestors and elders, and at least on Treaty 7, by the treaty relationship with the Crown and the nation-to-nation relationship with the governments. Treaty 7, our treaty that we live in, was signed into on September 19, 1877. However, the term signed is not used, as we as First Nations people did not fully comprehend the concept of signing legally binding contracts. The First Nations viewed treaties to maintain peace and friendship with newcomers while retaining our rights to our lands and practices as determined by our elders and leaderships. And so I want to bring up these components of legality to say, did we sign into a treaty or did we enter into an agreement? And if we entered into an agreement, how are we bound to this document that was pre-developed for us, not even co-developed, pre-developed for us for the determination of the benefit of the newcomers who still take benefit of the resources and the economic practices, all the things that have afforded them many riches in our lands. And so I often challenge this notion to say, yes, we will utilize this as a mechanism of our rights because you now have a controlling government that we seemingly have to delegate authority to. However, I am not going to be able to confidently say that we signed into something when our chiefs didn't even have the chance to sign their names or their traditional ways of describing themselves. A contract today, if any one of us went to AT&T, TELUS, Bell, and signed an X on a contract, that X could be null and void. If you are literate and you are able to understand something, you have to understand that agreement in order for it to hold weight. Did our people understand these agreements? Did our people sign into losing our lands and ceding any resources? Did our people decide to take part in economic practices that didn't align with our ways of knowing? Did our people relinquish authority to the buffalo that provided us sustenance and economy? I would say not. I would say our people didn't enter into agreements where our children would be stolen, where we may have missed out on the opportunity to see beautiful babies dancing on a stage with exuberance. And it is up to us to call upon and call account to these governments to say, you don't derive that authority, we do. For our legal orders and our source laws to hold weight, we are going to continue to be vocal and continue to be very stern in our stance of how we understand and realize these treaty components and our rights components as it pertains to government relationships. First Nations use treaties away from colonial governments as a means to maintain peace and friendship with the newcomers, and I will stand by that. I will stand by a peace and a friendship, as when I work with federal, provincial governments, colonial governments, I always come with the intents of peace and friendship. You can always maintain kindness is free. Being kind to one another is free. It doesn't mean we're always going to have to be nice. Sometimes we are going to have to stand up and be stern, and it may not come across as nice, but I will never go and be unkind, as taught by my elders and my ancestors, while retaining our rights to our lands and practices as determined by our elders and our leadership. To settle conflicts with First Nations, Canada gained territory and resources through treaty agreements. Canada's dishonesty and unmet promises, while mitigating commitments through legislation, perpetuate systemic harm. The Canadian government and authorities remain seemingly unaware of the challenges and consequences of our treaty agreements, including the nation-to-nation agreement. I bring this up and I say this to say, when I was sitting there in Parliament, again, in Public Safety Canada, and to not name any names because it wasn't malicious or ill-intended. In fact, I have a lot of confidence and I have a lot of kindness and even respect and love in my heart for the people that I've maintained relationships with. It's to say the blissful unawareness, or the seemingly unaware way in which colonial governments don't acknowledge or don't take time to learn, don't educate themselves on the components of our rights and our needs. It further exacerbates systemic harms that were already created by these governments meant to extinguish us. And again, I always remind the governments of Canada, we entered into these agreements not at our demise. We entered into this agreement because we saw that there was enough on our lands, dish with one spoon, the wampum belts, to cohesively exist, to equitably exist, to exist in a manner that otherwise imbues peace and friendship. When we describe treaty in our languages on Tsuut'ina, it translates to making relatives. Because regardless of your skin color, regardless of your belief, equity is a belief that we as First Nations have always shared. We have always shared partnerships. The Tsuut'ina had to live with the Blackfoot and Stoney Nakoda nations. I'd imagine out in 6 nations, there are 6 nations that had to live in a cohesive environment of understanding, in a way where we see each other. We're not looking at each other, we're seeing each other. As I learned from my Maori brothers and sisters, when you go to a Maori ceremony, they truly look at you and they see you, and they say that to you. They'll say, I'm trying to see you. I'm not looking at you, I'm seeing you. All that to say, we're developing an understanding. And I say this to also remind colonial governments, systems approaches, they don't work for us, otherwise they would have worked. And if we were to, and retain the right to, develop legal orders and legislation on our land, we'd also account for seeing one another and foreseeing all of the possibilities of pitfalls before we fall into any one of those holes, or before we are pulling people up from the river. We should also maintain and we retain the ability to build our economic systems in order to sustain themselves. If you ever read the letters delivered by James McLeod in Treaty 7, and McLeod Trail is named after him, he states in one of his letters, and maybe not verbatim, so this isn't a quote, but we want to provide the Indians with enough sustenance to sustain themselves. right there, that reads to me that he understood that we require economy as it's currently described. Now in our languages, I would say that we probably didn't describe it as economy, we describe it as ways of being, working with the land, understanding one another, building community. Not to take more than what is needed for the sake of our own benefit, for the sake of our own ego, but to take just enough so that each one of us can live in harmony with the lands that we require to live with. Canadian people and government personnel who represent them are bound by treaties. No treaties in Canada or the US have been rescinded, and they implicate all citizens who benefit from stolen land and resources, and this is internationally. Treaties are an international document recognized by the UN, and treaties were entered into so that we may all benefit from land and resources, and it was our partners in treaty who were dishonest and took benefit. Treaty 1, which was signed at the Battle of Wounded Knee, the day after that treaty was signed, that government, the US government, went in and caused an extermination of those people. So treaties, in many ways, are mechanisms by which colonial governments create these relationships and then continue to break them. And I am at a space, and I am at a galvanized voices to say, no more. We need to hold you responsible to these obligations that you have created. We didn't create this. In fact, our treaties were entered into so that we may understand one another. Again, we called it making relatives because that's what we understood that we were doing. We understood that in times where we were having a difficulty on Tsuut'ina Nation, we required an understanding through a treaty, a buffalo treaty, an exchange of ceremony, exchange of medicines, so that we may all benefit from those buffalo that we require to live. When there are harsh times and you have to adapt to the winters or to the landscape, we all had to live in harmony with one another, and that was what we understood treaty to be. It is colonial governments who continue to break their promises and continue to force us to live under legislative authorities and practices and mechanisms and systems that don't work for our people. And I challenge governments constantly to say, would that work for your communities? Would a year-to-year funding model for your policing service, would that work in the city of Calgary? Would a year-to-year funding model for your education, on your schools, for your children, would that work? If we were to teach your children about our truth in history, would that work for your children? So if it doesn't work for your children, why are we an exception? Why are we placed into a box that doesn't allow us to create the mechanisms and the legislation, the legal orders that can allow us to thrive and prosper? We are constantly put in boxes. We are constantly put in chokeholds, in policies, in terms and conditions, in those fine prints where they think, and they have for generations, gotten away and done away to say, ooh, well, look, we're gonna read the fine prints. You can't hire a lawyer. We're gonna read the fine prints. Well, I guess you can't do this. Then how are we going to achieve if we can't do? That wouldn't work for your community. Why do we continue to be the exception? I'm still waiting for an answer to that. I work constantly with my elder Regina Crowchild, who I heard was TikTok famous after the last AFN. All that to say, it is very important that we remain accountable, remain steadfast in where we derive our rights, because I do believe that we hold the answers. I don't even believe it. I will confirm and I will say we hold the answers to what can achieve and acquire solutions that work for our people on our lands. If governments would just understand that. But the seeming ignorance is they continue to commit to not. Treaties are crucial as they establish the rights of our peoples inside our traditional land base, now known as reservations. And again, it pains me to even say that because this was all of our land base. Our rights include the capacity to establish our own government, economy, laws, values, and practices for our societies and communities. The treaties allow First Nations to pursue policies that give autonomy from federal and provincial government legislation. The treaty allows our leaders to make decisions based on the knowledge of our First Nations people. When I go into community, and it's one of my favorite things to do, is to say, I am truly here as a lifelong student. I'm here to learn. Because I recognize that so many of our elders were never afforded the opportunity to go to post-secondary institutions to know how these systems work. That so many of our brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers are dealing with intergenerational trauma. And because of that cloud, because of the cloud of addiction, they're not able to see until tomorrow. They're not able to even see people because they can't see themselves. When we don't take up the driver's seat and take up the helm of responsibility to go into communities and get in the way by ways of all these expectations of colonial governments, we miss that opportunity to learn from one another, to see one another, to really encourage one another, to give each other back that gift of confidence, to say, I see you, and not only do I see you, but I believe in you, because I want to learn from you. I often say when I go into my communities, I only know what I know. And in fact, I'm more excited about what I don't know, because when I know better, I can do better. And it's something that I am constantly advocating for in white governments, is to say, it sounds like your mind is poor. And because your mind is poor, I'm going to introduce you to some elders who are going to enlighten you on some of the shortcomings that they have experienced under your systems. I always say, and I always will encourage young people, I say, you need to take 1,000% of the shots your ancestors were never afforded to. Not that they didn't want to, it's because these establishments came in as we came in with the intention of peace and friendship, and they broke those promises and continue to. And so I think it's important, again, that we work with one another and we encourage one another, while also looking at creative ways to, and I don't even like to use the word funding, I say value. I say this because Treasury seems to respond better to that than funding. That, oh, we have to fund this reserve, oh, we have to fund the initiative, or, oh, well, this is gonna cut into our funding. Well, let's look at it creatively and let's talk about it in a way that actually supports your communities, and let's add value back into it. When you add value into First Nations communities, then if we were also allowed to develop and inform our own data and data security and privacy, data is so important, and I recommend everybody here, hold on to your data. Do not at all delegate that authority to anyone except for your leadership. Hold on to it. Now, the findings from that data, as we're going to be doing on our website, share it. Share that knowledge, but don't give that data away. Data is how a lot of government and institutions formulate their findings to come up with a metric to determine how they're going to find solutions. And I do think it is incumbent for our people and for people to utilize data and to foster it. I'm also trying to discover and determine how it is described in communities by our languages, because that's also very important. How we collected data. I would say in Stoney Nakoda Nations, it was described to me very recently, is that we didn't really look at data, but we looked at natural law. We looked at what the waters were doing, how the birds were flying, what was happening around us, and it really indicated how we were going to make differences. And so I encourage everybody to, again, as you develop your data, as you go into communities and share these conversations, as we share with one another, learn from that, and also, as I always do, put yourself in a state of studenthood, because we are all lifelong learners, or at least my grandmother, who's 95, and she says, I think one of the successes of me is I always wanted to be a student. I always wanted to remain learning. And she was a teacher, her career was being a teacher. And she said, the amount that I learned from my kids, from the kids I was teaching, was so much more than I got from my university education. It taught me so much more about people and our people. And including how to punish them, because she's on my screensaver, because even yesterday she said, oh, coming in front of your grandma is sometimes scarier than going in front of a judge. So she's on me on my screen as a screensaver, just in case I ever need a reminder. The treaty does not solve all the difficulty facing First Nations communities. The treaties allow us to exercise our citizenship rights on our lands, including traditional customs and knowledge that would otherwise be suppressed by colonial laws. Treaties allow us to maintain customs that reflect our First Nations people and align with the original meaning of the treaty. We will act with peace and friendship towards newcomers while acknowledging the collective needs for its survival. We should establish procedures and practices that uphold rights and obligations for all, fostering community supports that for all the occupants of our lands as per the treaty. And so all that to say, I want to thank you for your time. I, before lunch, hope to encourage a conversation, and I hope that I have given you all enlightenment as to how we utilize the treaty, how we look at the treaty, but how we are fostering conversations to enact tangible change so that the 7 generations from now, those babies will live in forests that they can flourish in. My elders always say, if you're gonna plant a seed, make sure you nourish it, because eventually that's gonna become a forest. And you wanna make sure that the babies that are yet unborn, that they will be able to flourish and exist in harmony and in peace, while also thriving in those spaces and in those ecosystems. So I wanna thank you for all your time today.